your life. My name is Anna and I'm Avila Spaces Community Manager. Today our guest is Michaela Simpson from the Neuroleadership Institute. Hello, Michaela.
Hello.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our topic today is the science of speaking up in a work context. Before we jump to our team, Michaela, please explain us what you do on your daily basis and what the Neuroleadership Institute does.
Right. Well, that's kind of a big question because I do a lot of things on a daily basis and I wear many hats. But overall, I would say I call myself a researcher or a behavioral scientist more specifically. And I really love to observe human behavior. And I have the pleasure that I get to be able to do that in my job. I do that anyway, but I do that in my job. And one of the things that I do is that I translate, and this is kind of abstract and I'll break it down, but I translate the science that's out there from social psychology, social neuroscience, and cognitive neuroscience, which basically means you have researchers out there who are wondering, like, how do humans behave? Let's study that in a particular context. And they usually do it in terms of when it's neuroscience with the brain, and they'll put people in a scanner, but they'll have this overarching question of, like, how do people behave under stress, or how is their mindset affected, and how does that show up in the brain when they're challenged, for example. So I translate that science and use it to create behavior change strategies. That's kind of a big term, but behavior change strategies for organizations. So basically, how can we help our people adapt to change? So there might be an organization that's going through a major acquisition or a merger, or they're going to have to lay off people, or there's just what we just experienced recently with the pandemic, and we have to go into this hybrid form of work. How do we help our people adapt to change so they can still stay present and do their jobs? How can we build better leaders? Questions like that. So what that looks like is I work on external projects with clients where I work with our consultants. I work with instructional designers. They're the ones who actually build workshops and learning, kind of like they're part of like what people do in learning and development. How do we create learning systems that people can help learn new things? I work with them. I work with our sales team. I help develop internal intellectual products. I do a lot of writing. I write a lot on research and create research briefings. I give presentations.
Yes,
I write for journals. So there are a lot of things. And sometimes I'm doing all of those in one day.
Yes, your plate is full.
My plate is full.
Let's go to our team. Speaking up in work environments. First of all, what is speaking up in this case?
Yeah. So in this case, we're talking about speaking up in organizations. So basically speaking up in the workplace. And this is about speaking up in ways that are meant to improve processes that are going on, rather than I'm going to complain. We all complain, about where we work. But it's not about I'm going to complain or I just want to hear myself talk.
Yeah.
It's more about, am I speaking up in a way that's going to improve a situation, in a way that will benefit the organization, that will benefit my colleague or my team?
We have 3 acts of speaking up, from the least challenging to the most sharing your ideas, question other people's decisions, and challenging other people's behaviors. Can you explain that?
Sure. We created this kind of continuum with this idea that speaking up can look many ways in the workplace. And some of them, for some people, might be like, what do you mean sharing ideas? That's like no big deal. And some people are very comfortable speaking up, regardless of the dynamics. But for a lot of us, it can be, even sharing ideas can be a little bit tricky. And a certain level, it's the least kind of stressful situation, but still, there might be situations where you might be in a meeting and you might have a great idea of like, what about if we did, instead of doing X, we do Y? In some organizations, that's not a safe thing to do. You might have a manager who is very vocal and might yell. There are people who are in organizations where people get yelled at. Or they might think that, if you make a suggestion that you might be trying to make me look bad, or you might be punished or berated for sharing ideas. And so for some people, they observe that it's actually not safe to speak up and to share an idea. Now, other people, it's like, oh, no, in my organization with my boss, I can share an idea if there's something I want to suggest. If they want to challenge a decision, however, or question a decision, that might be another level. They're like, yeah, I can share an idea, but I don't know if I say to my boss, maybe you're an accounting firm. Now, I'm not an accountant, but say you're an accounting firm and your firm wants to, or your boss wants to go one direction with using some kind of analysis or something like that, and you might say, well, actually, it might be better that if we look at it this way and we kind of do our analysis this way. That is kind of questioning a decision, and that might create a higher level of stress in the person who's speaking up, and a higher level of you might receive some pushback from that. Again, you might have a boss who might yell, who might berate you. There are instances, there's all kinds of interesting research that people have done where, people express what happens. And if we do that, we get yelled at, or I might get demoted, or I might not get assigned to that next good project. Yes. And so that's a little bit higher level of threat. Now, if you question somebody's behavior, and now I'm not talking about, when we talk about where I work, we are not going into the realm, and this is, using United States things, right? Yes. That we're not talking about areas of where you're definitely going into areas of sexual harassment or discrimination, where there are legal issues, which we call compliance. Those are issues where you actually have to be taken to to certain channels, and that's a different thing. We're talking more about those things where it's you heard something or you saw something being done, you're like, that kind of doesn't sit right. Should I speak up? Should I not speak up? And often why people don't speak up is because of these power dynamics, but it's more in those areas where it's kind of that it's not clearly sexual harassment, it's not clear discrimination. It could be other things that are just kind of inappropriate, and that gets a little bit more tricky.
The way you treat your employees, for instance?
The way that you treat your employees or comments you might make. And so this is not an uncommon phenomenon. I'll just keep it within the U.S. I don't want to extrapolate. But, somebody might say to a young female in office, oh, so when are you getting married?
Oh.
Or when are you going to have kids?
Yes.
That's kind of it's inappropriate to ask. Yeah. Do you go up to a man? We don't talk about those in the workplace.
Yes.
Yeah,
we were talking the other day about companies that have a lot of problems of speaking up. For instance, medical industry. But another ones, can you give us an example or various examples of situations when people don't speak up? Bad things happen.
Yes, I was telling you about one of them the other day, and that was with the Challenger, one of the space shuttles.
Yes.
That went up, and unfortunately it blew up. And there was a story about one of the engineers who, even decades later, regretted not speaking up. And the thing is, he did speak up. There are a group of engineers who realized, wait, there's an issue here, we need to delay the launch. And they went to their superiors and they weren't listened to, and it blew up. And, he's no longer alive, but again, he carried so much guilt, feeling like he should have done more. But that's also something I want to bring up, where people do speak up and they're not heard. They're not listened to.
But what can people do in that case?
What can they do in that case? And so, a lot of that is about, we need to put the onus on the leaders and on the organizations, because there's only so much that you or I can do. It's like saying, oh, Anna, you have to solve everything. It's up to you to speak up. If you don't speak up, then, it's really upon the leaders, the managers of organizations to create what we call psychological safety, a community where people feel safe to speak up. And psychological safety, that comes from Amy Edmondson. She's a researcher out of Harvard. Okay. She writes all about this. And this is basically where people feel safe to speak up without fear of retribution, of being shamed, or anything like that. And so, and again, we're imagining we're speaking up for good and with respect.
Not just speaking up for the sake of speaking.
Exactly.
Yes, of course.
Right. And so there are ways for organizations to go about doing that, and for leaders and managers to model that behavior, to say, we're in a meeting and say, I'm the manager, and we have our team, and I ask people, I really want to know your ideas. Please share them. And push back against me. And I've worked with some leaders who say that I actually want to hear, because this is how we get better.
Yes,
and it's true. That's how we get better. That's how we innovate. And so when they say that, it's really important. But guess what? Very important part. They also have to live that. They have to model that, because sometimes people will say,
yes,
right?
of course. When people say you can speak up, it's safe, then they don't do nothing with the information.
Yeah.
And then we are afraid again to talk. What can we do? Because people don't put our ideas to work. What can we do? What can companies do in that case?
Well, so again, it's about companies really setting that priority and really wanting to do that. And and again, often we can talk to companies and say, hey, look, when you have psychological safety, you're going to have more innovation. There's actually an interesting study. It's called Project Aristotle through Google. They wanted to look at their teams and what are the characteristics that you find in very successful teams. And they found like one of the top ones that was a contributing factor to successful teams was psychological safety.
Okay.
So you get in a team and say you're there to create a new product. We want people to be creative, right? So we don't want to say, oh, Anna, that is such a stupid idea, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to come out and give us more ideas, but when, you can go back and forth and, even fail, we say like failing upwards or actually celebrating failures, because we learn from our failures, we learn from our mistakes, and it's okay to say things and just to test them out. And because it does lead to innovation, we find the innovation leads to, greater revenue.
Of course,
so, sometimes that can appeal to companies of like, oh, wait, that means we can, increase
you
our
were
profit.
talking about a very weird word that you have on the States. It's like a third party where you can go and share your ideas.
Oh, like an ombud?
Yes.
Yeah. So
can you explain that?
Yes, thanks for bringing that up. So another way that people or organizations can create kind of a safe space for people, as they're developing safety. So I want to go back to the thing of like, oh, yes, we want you to share with us. And then you do, and then they either like don't acknowledge, or they berate you, or they still treat you horribly for what you said or feel offended, or like you say, they don't do anything about it. One of the ways you can do for people to feel more comfortable and to kind of build that sense of trust and safety is to create an ombuds office. And so that's something, and that's OMBUD.
I don't know how to say that word.
I know, it's like such an interesting word. So it's an ombuds person, and you'll find that, for example, in universities in the U.S., like in public universities, where it's an independent office. And where if you have an issue, it might be with your superior. So if you're a graduate student, it might be with your mentor or with your advisor or with some other professor. And anybody in the organization can go and you call them up, and you do not communicate through email. You leave a phone message, they call you back. There's like really no written track of it. You go to their office, you talk to them. They're kind of like a neutral third party, and they can help you. And that often is usually with interpersonal issues, but it might be indicative of more systemic issues. But you can go to them and they can help guide you and who you can talk to. And sometimes they say, would you like us to bring in this other person? And we'll be like a third neutral party. And you have that option, but you have at least somewhere to share your ideas and concerns in a safe way where they're not going to go and call up, the professor and say, oh,
you have a complaint.
Exactly.
Does that work for companies, for instance, or not?
Yeah, so I don't know to what extent which companies have that, but I imagine some could have that. Because there's also HR, but then, that's kind of can be a little tricky. And it really depends on the organization and of course the kind of culture they have created. But I think there are some companies that will have some element of that.
This example from the emergency room where you have the surgeons, the nurses, and then a third party. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And I don't want to misspeak it. I don't want to. No, it's okay. But basically, the general premise, and I don't want to identify. But there's as somebody who works in the space of an executive coach. Coaches often, they're not therapists, but they're also how can we engage in positive behavior change, based on your goals. But sometimes there are organizations who will say to certain people, we need you to learn how to listen more. So it's like a person in power. And for example, you have a lot of studies in emergent and medicine doesn't have to be emergency medicine.
Of course, yes.
You have it also in aviation with pilots, but you know, you have levels of hierarchy, and so if you're in an operating room, surgeons are usually, you know, at the top, but they also have to be able to listen because there are lives that can be lost. So there was, I learned about somebody who actually went in as a coach to make sure that the configuration, or basically the surgeons were listening to everyone in the room, that everybody was listening to everyone, and they would provide guidance, like right in surgery. And it was, I don't know if it's normally done. Obviously, it was legally okay. They were not taking part in the surgery, but I was like, wow, that's a very good example. Yes.
But what can companies do? For instance, a co-working space. What can we do so everybody gets listened? Everybody can share their opinions, like boxes where we can put our ideas.
Boxes. I mean, you already have these social events, it seems
of
like.
Course, yes.
I mean, I came in here as a stranger, and you just brought me in, and you know, you made me feel included and that I belong, and those are things we talk about. Yes. And I mean, this organization or this space, you actually really do that, and I think you get the sense already. Like, I feel like, oh, I can trust you. I feel this warmth from Anna and from Carlos and from your coworkers. And so I think a lot of it is like, how do you approach people? It's like, are you even paying attention to, do you make eye contact? Do you stop and say hello?
Yes.
Do you know, even a nod? And people in here do that. And those go a long way, because that signals to me, oh, it's safe here. And then you have this friendly exchange. And so you already have created this environment. On top of that, you could explicitly say to people, we are interested in your feedback.
Yes.
We want to hear it. And then if they say it, you don't say, no, that we're not going to do that. You know, if you're receptive to what people say, you model that, and you know, you could also have boxes if you like, but also that if you take those changes that make sense and you implement them, and people say, oh, they listen to what we say. In certain ways, it's kind of simple, right?
Yeah, it's very simple.
Yes.
I was reading that when you don't give your feedbacks, your ideas, maybe some leaders can think that you don't care at all about your job. Why do people think that? Because we were talking, introverts have a really hard time speaking their minds. What can be done so people don't think that we don't care? Because we care, but we are not very vocal about it.
Exactly. And so, and if I get it correctly, I mean, it's almost like it's not only just speaking up necessarily, but just, I mean, speaking like in a meeting, yes. Right? And it's really important for leaders to understand that we process information differently.
Of course.
Some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts, and then there's like another level of some of us are internal processors and some are external processors. And we were talking about this the other day, and I was saying, I'm an internal processor. I get information and I'm thinking about it, I'm turning around in my head, and you know, this is all going on here, and I just need to process it here. And there are other people, they'll just immediately start speaking. Yes. And for me, I need to have something well formed. And so it can be that external processors or, you know, extroverts will be rewarded because, you know, they care more or they know more. And so again, it's very important for leaders to know and for managers to know that we all process differently. And, you know, how do we make an environment more inclusive so people feel, and sometimes people might feel safe to share, but they need to share on their own terms in their own way. Yes. And sometimes it might not be in front of a big group of people. It might be one-on-one. It might be in written form in different ways.
The medium is very important, right? Because if I want a work promotion, I won't send an email. I go face-to-face with my boss and ask him, how can we know what's the right medium to talk? Or to speak up? Right.
I think for the individual, you need to know what's comfortable for you.
Yes.
Now, at the same time, you also kind of need to, we say, read the room.
Of course.
You know, if you have a leader or a manager who's like only pays attention if people talk to him in person, or some like you have to send them something in writing first, then you have to be aware of that. But I think ultimately I'll just say for you to feel comfortable, you need to know like, okay, where do I find my strength? Yeah. Where do I feel comfortable? And there could be ways of like, how do I step into other mediums to figure out how could I experiment doing it this way? But doing it in a way that doesn't stress you out so much, because if we stress ourselves out so much, or we get even terrified. So talk a little bit about the brain. We
Yes.
have the prefrontal cortex, and that's, our decision-making, executive planning, how do I think rationally? How do I collaborate? How do I solve problems? To do that, we need to be in a pretty calm state. We need to be a little bit activated, but not completely stressed out. If we get stressed out, or we're threatened, or we're afraid, we go into what we call the limbic system, where we're very reactive, right? And it's kind of that emotional impulse, and rage even is like a whole other level. It's just super reactive. So you're not in that prefrontal cortex space. And so, if you stress yourself out too much, you're not going to be able to go to your boss and have a rational conversation.
Yes, of
so
course.
it's about, monitoring yourself and like, okay, where am I best in my headspace, so to speak.
You were talking about emotions. That's very important, because sometimes we can speak and maybe a coworker starts, is she talking again? Something like that. And then you get very nervous. And then you don't speak the next time. How not to get emotional when people start like that? When people you give an opinion and the other coworker has another opinion. How not to get so emotional?
Yeah. And so, part of that is what we call like emotion regulation.
Okay.
And it's just to notice, like in that moment, you can be like, oh my goodness, and get really anxious or really afraid or angry. People are different. And just to notice, oh, okay, I just realized I got really angry.
Yeah.
Let me just kind of calm down. And
it's something that comes within you. You
Yeah.
don't learn, you can't learn about that stuff, right?
You can't learn about...
You can consult for people not to get angry at other people. It comes from within
Right,
you.
it just comes out.
Okay.
And part of it is like in that moment to acknowledge it. And there's certain research on called affect labeling, of just like naming something, and rather than going into the anger or the anxiety of like, okay, I got angry, okay, let me take a step back. You can do what we call reappraise the situation. How can I look at this differently? Okay, I didn't really like their response. It kind of triggered me, but maybe they were coming from a different direction, or even they might have a different opinion, but I have mine. So there are ways you can start talking to yourself to look at the situation differently, so you don't get overwhelmed by the emotions. And again, it's not about stuffing down the emotions. It's like, how in the moment do I kind of look at it a different way so I can, move towards my goal, which might be to share my idea, or to realize, wait, it's okay for me to have a voice and I can still share.
We spoke earlier about the bad things that can happen when you talk. I was reading that lots of leaders see people who say bad things about their company as bad team players. Do companies that don't listen to their employees have big turnover rates? Do we have statistics about that?
Yeah, I think they're generally statistics like lots of things, like if people don't feel like they can be heard, there are lots, or people don't feel like they belong. And part of that is like, if you're not going to listen to me or listen to our needs, if they don't feel like they're included, people will tend to leave.
Yes.
Because if they're not happy, and if they do stay, their work productivity is going to suffer, right? They're going to tell people like, don't work there.
Yes.
And I'm just waiting for my way out. And as soon as I can, I'm going to leave. So you're going to have high turnover. And so that's not a good thing. And so you can look in any number of things, like what they're actually measuring, but ultimately it's kind of like, do people feel included, that they matter, that they're valued, that their voices matter? They're all kind of connected, and there's a clear connection to retention.
I know that you do a lot of webinars during the pandemic. Do you notice that people are more vocal about their ideas or not? They tend to stay quiet or not?
You know what? It completely depends on the culture. And, and I don't know necessarily how they were before the pandemic versus, because part of it people could feel more emboldened, like if they're off camera and they're just putting something in the chat and maybe not a lot of people are paying attention to, oh, it was Anna who said that. It depends on how many people are in. And I would make a comment that, I've noticed like just different cultures, like if I give a webinar for an organization and there's it's the same topic, and some are just like writing in the chat a lot and have questions, and sometimes we give them the capability to come off off mute. So they sometimes will like, hey, would you like to share more with us? And they're really happy to do that. And there's some cultures where they're more reserved and they're not going to write as much. And so,
you told me that you give the option to talk anonymously.
Right, yeah, because sometimes...
Is that a good strategy?
I think so. So sometimes when we, if I'm giving a keynote or a presentation to an organization where it's just their organization, we find out, like, what's the flavor? Some are like, oh no, our people are so on top of this topic,
yes.
They're going to be very participatory. And some will like, yeah, they're a little bit more reserved. And for those, I always give everybody the option, but especially those that might have a more reserved culture, to say, I always tell people, if you have questions or comments at any point that I'm talking, put them in the chat and I'll try to address them. And for those that are more a little bit on the quiet side, I say you can just message me directly. We use Zoom, on Zoom or their platform, which could be WebEx or something else. But message me directly and just write anonymously, because sometimes I like to be interactive. I'm like, oh, look, we just got a question. Anna just said la la la. So I just tell them, just mark it anonymous, and I'll be sure that I won't say your name, but I will ask the question. So that allows them to still voice a question, a concern, but without being revealed as to who they are.
But do people use that?
They do. Like I did one recently, and yeah, I got questions in, and about 98% of the questions were to me directly.
Okay.
And when I asked, like, oh, are there any questions? Pause. Like, nobody came off mute, which is fine, because I didn't expect them to. But they also didn't write directly in the chat. They were writing questions as I was speaking. So I think they were writing as things as I was speaking. And yeah. So they did take part.
We're almost finishing. Yes. Unfortunately, it's been amazing having you here. But do workplaces where people can speak their mind are more happy, are happier, and employees stay longer? We talked about it, but do they?
Right. Generally, like, I don't want to quote, but like if you read things like from Deloitte, would probably put out some things like this. But generally, when people feel like they have a voice, they feel they're respected, they're more likely to stay, they have more loyalty, they're more likely to do what they call discretionary behaviors, things that are above and beyond their job. Like, they don't have to do certain things, but they do it anyway because they love their job, they're committed to what they do, they like the people they work with, they feel they can bring their authentic selves to work, they're likely to stay longer, and they're more likely to suggest to other people, you should work at my company.
Just to finish, in a short sentence, why do you need to speak up?
Speaking up really helps improve the environment, the climate for everyone. And again, we're going from the perspective of the idea that we're looking to improve a situation. It can lead to innovation. It could lead to a greater sense of belonging, a greater sense of trust. And all of this is just a positive feedback loop for the individuals, for teams, and for the organization as a whole. And it does improve the bottom line.
Yes. Michaela, before we go, how can we find you online and the Neuroleadership Institute?
Yes.
If we want a webinar with you, for instance.
Yes, thank you. So you can look me up on LinkedIn, Michaela Simpson, and that's Michael with an A, and Simpson, like the TV show, The Simpsons, and look me up on LinkedIn, and then it's neuroleadership.com.
Okay.
It's like a mouthful. And basically our tagline is, we use science to make organizations more human. So
thank you so much.
Thank
it
you
was
for having
so insightful. Me. Thank you so much.
It was such a pleasure.
We'll be back next week with another guest. Thank you so much for watching.